we go. So that gives me a second chance, doesn't it? Lovely. So we're looking at framing our conversation with the idea of imagination infrastructure rather than imagination practice, although we will definitely loop into practice. But infrastructure gives us a slightly wider frame. It's the context within which we use this practice, as well as the practice itself. So how does this work as infrastructure to enable regenerative futures? And the two things we're particularly interested in looking at today are how imagination can flow into agency, so changing the world, not just imagining something different, but then that actually becoming realized in the world, agency, and also how what the sort of craft or the skills of an imagination practitioner are that enable social change to happen. So there's a bit of a connection there. So some of the skills are skills around facilitation. We might well go into that. But other skills are like, how do you design a project or an intervention or I don't know what community idea, or fill in the gap of how you'd like to a piece of imagination work. How do you design that in a way that also is looking to see real impact and agency in the world? So those are our two questions, one about agency and one about the craft of the practitioner in supporting agency. Hope that makes sense. And I'm going to hand over to Ruth now, who's going to tell us a bit about this work she's been doing to help us frame our conversation as we go.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Hannah. So as Hannah mentioned, the research has been commissioned by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And what we've been doing is looking at what the research base is for this emerging field of collective imagination practice and the imagination infrastructuring that supports that collective practice. Within that, we've been looking back through the academic literature to look at the people who have been thinking actively about this. So the people who've been thinking about infrastructures and how infrastructures work, and the way in which infrastructures, whether they're physical or social, are always relational. We've been looking at the fields of imagination in a whole range of areas, from social psychology to ecological imagination to decolonial imagination, to try and get under the skin of what it is what it is that we mean when we talk about collective imagination, and how we might think about and put into practice imagination modes of imagination infrastructuring that help us work actively, help us support communities to work actively into social change. And in doing that, we are hugely keen that the research that we're doing acts as a resource for practitioners. We're also hoping to support an ongoing research community who will be continuing to interrogate this area, so that we have research working alongside and interrelating with practice in a really exciting way, I hope. So I am just going to talk you through what we've taken from the review of that literature and from the interviews that we've done with a range of people, including Penny and Mikkel, who are with us on the call today. So these are the assumptions that, through our conversations with academics who've been thinking and practicing with this work, and through our review of the literature, we've come to. So imagination is a critical social capacity for opening up possibilities for social and environmental justice. So we're doing this work for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So the work that we're doing comes with a particular stance. It's the stance that is asking how imagination practices might help to advance social and ecological justice. Secondly, and informed by the literature and the interviews, we acknowledge that imagining is resourced by economic, social, and cultural practices. So imagination and imagining doesn't happen in isolation. It's always relational, and it's resourced by the context in which we live and practice. It's resourced by our memories. It's resourced by the environments that we live in. It's resourced by the influence of others. It's resourced by moments of transgression that we might have experienced. And so imagination is always resourced by economic, social, and cultural practices. And there are both dominant economic, social, and cultural practices and economic, social, and cultural practices emerging in the margins or that have always been there. We also find that these resources are structured in ways that create barriers to participation and uneven contexts and opportunities for the practices of imagining. So there are barriers to participation in collective imagining, and some of those might be the dominant economic and social structures themselves. So the economic and social structures that paint us as atomized individuals rather than part of a collective, those might themselves be barriers to participation. Other barriers might be who has the time to come together and imagine collectively. So barriers might be the barriers that are put in place to collective activity in many forms. And while we're thinking about that, we also acknowledge that for many communities and for many people, imagination has been a tool for, and collective imagination has been a tool for resistance over time. We also find that many ways of imagining are unseen or unacknowledged because they are happening in the margins. As the academic Sadiya Hartman says, so much of the work of oppression is about policing the imagination. So acknowledging that imagining is a tool of resistance, and it can be unacknowledged more broadly when it's happening in the margins. We also come to the conclusion that the uneven participation in practices of social imagining impoverishes our collective imagination and reduces our ability to respond dynamically to the challenges of our times. So collective imagination requires all of us. And going back to that point about imagination and imagining being relational, if we're not including everybody in our practices of imagining, we're not drawing on the full resources of humanity. We are leaving out hugely important parts of the resource that could be our collective imagination. So if we are to respond to the challenges of our time, we need everybody's imagination. And that means, as practitioners, actively working to ensure just participation in imagination practices. So from that, we take that intentional efforts are required to create pluralistic and just imagination practices, which must address power and privilege. So how do we create the landscapes in which everybody is able to participate? And that has to be an active and ongoing, effort. Just two more to go, so I am coming to the end with these. And when we look at that, we acknowledge that these efforts to ensure just participation require infrastructural thinking. So they require us to pay attention to how material, organizational, and social practices structure modes of participation in social imagining. So acknowledging that those economic, social structures and practices shape how we participate in social imagining. So that's where the infrastructural, how do we design these projects in which we're inviting people to collectively imagine, becomes absolutely critical. And then finally, the material, organisation and social practices that we're talking about can take the form of cultural, educational, political, media, artistic, activist, economic organisation and modes of encounter. So we need to think about the full realm of imagination infrastructuring and how they affect people's ability in social imagining. So how can we cultivate practices of social imagining, both within the projects that we run and more broadly within society? So that's where we've got to with this working set of assumptions. They are work in progress very much, and we really expect them to evolve and shift over time. And we've been testing them out with the academics that we've been speaking to, and they have already evolved from our starting point. And we're super interested in any reflections, feedback that any of you have, points where you find resonance, points where they're useful to you, or points where you find dissonance. But we're going to work with these today to go into these questions of agency. What are the social structures? What are the social structures that shape how we might imagine? And what is the craft of the practitioner? What is the skill of the practitioner in shaping the contexts in which people can come together to collectively imagine and act into that imagination? That's it from me. So I'll hand back to Hannah.
Lovely. Yeah, would you like to just stop sharing your screen for a moment, Ruth?
Yes.
All right. So yes, sure, Frederica, we will do that. I'll put those points in the chat, or Ruth, if you're able to. I'm not sure if I've got the most up-to-date version of them.
Yes, I will. I'll put those in the chat now.
Yeah, lovely. So what we're going to do now is we're going to split into 4 groups. There's going to be 2 groups which are exploring this question around agency, and 2 groups which are exploring question around craft. Okay, and I'll just wait for Ruth to paste those in, or actually I could do these first.
I will be there in a second.
You'll be there in a second, great. Okay, so the agency groups, I'd like you to be considering what conditions or structures for using imagination practice enable it to be a driver for societal transformation. A simple way of saying that is what enables people to move from imagination to action. And as Ruth was saying, really thinking about the sort of social connections that enable that. And then the craft groups, what aspects of the craft of the imagination practitioner enables marginalized ways of imagining to become visible? How do we do that well? What conditions or structures act as barriers to this? Okay. Do those feel like clear questions? Now, we haven't really decided, Ruth, whether we give people the option of joining, or are we going to just put them into groups? I don't know. I'm just wondering whether people will feel drawn towards a particular question. Do you have a feeling about that?
Maybe we can take a bit of a temperature check.
Yeah,
and see whether people do feel drawn to a particular question, or yeah.
If you feel like, oh, there's one of those 2 questions, I really hope I'm in that group. Can you just let us know? Like, okay, well, how about, there's enough of us for me to see all of you. Put your hands up, your actual real hand, if you fancy the one about agency and structures to get to agency. 1, 2. Oh, yeah, we got 1, 2. Okay, and
actually I had a question before I could answer that. Sorry.
Okay.
You read the definitions? I just see them as so overlapping. I'm having trouble.
They are.
Do you know what I mean?
They are massively overlapping.
So would it matter? Like, could we just sort of I mean, I don't want to break but like, I bet the groups are going to talk about both of them anyways, is what my guess is.
It's possible. It's possible. I want to do both. Me too. I could go either. I think we just do random groups and let you do both. However, people, I want some answers out the other end. So one of you will please take responsibility for reporting back. And I'll be asking you what felt core or common in your conversation, and what felt maybe edgy or difficult to articulate. So if there's one of you will nominate yourself as a kind of reporter backer, and I don't want a summary of everything that was said. I just want you to focus on what felt really core in your conversations and what felt like kind of edgy or had potential conflict around it, or there was difference, or just very difficult to articulate. Does that make sense? So I'd love one of you to come back and just give us that back from each group. All right, so I think the decision is we're going into random groups and you get to choose to talk for one and then the other. And we'll have about half an hour. So actually it's quite a lot of time to be able to explore these things. So I think that that should work well. If you run out of one question, feel free to move to the other. Are you happy with that, Ruth?
Sounds perfect.
Great. Well, let's
and just to add that Hannah and I will probably pop in and out of groups, so we'd like to be part of the conversations too. So we will pop in and out. If any of you suffer an internet breakdown, or you lose connection for any reason and find yourself evicted from your group, just message us and we will come back out to put you back in a group.
Real. All right, let's be sent.
Yeah. Let's go.
Oh, my son has the way the sun has gone.
The sun has just,
yeah.
It's just.
Welcome back, everyone. Ruth has just joined us, which is wonderful. So she's going to get to hear another Ruth, I should say, our second Ruth today.
Ruth.
And she will be able to hear all our juicy insights. Ruth, I don't know about you, but I just stayed in one group because it was so great. I just ended up in one group.
I mean, both the groups that I joined were fantastic.
Yeah.
Hugely rich and interesting conversations, but I did manage to move between two groups.
Oh, well done. Okay, so Ruth, are you up for inviting?
Yeah, totally. So we know that there have been, well, we clearly know because Hannah and I have both had the great pleasure of dipping into your conversations. We know that there have been really rich conversations happening in the groups, and we want to make sure that those conversations are heard in the whole room. So we would like to invite you to share some of your reflections from those conversations. And what we're going to have about 20 minutes to do that. And then we're going to finish with a whole group discussion when we draw out some of the implications of your discussions. But first of all, we'd like to hear what felt most core or important in your conversation and what you struggled with, what felt edgy or difficult to articulate. And I am going to ask in no particular order, but I might start by inviting group 3 to begin by sharing their reflections, because that was the group I joined first. So I don't know if Hilary or Kavitha or Kate would like to share.
Hilary's
I said I'd have a go. We talked mostly starting about the craft and I talked a bit. I spoke a bit about how getting people there when you're really aiming to get a genuine representation of a local neighbourhood, trying to get 200 people who genuinely represent a neighbourhood, and how you frame it in a way that it lands with people who might think that's not for me, or who this feels quite out there, or who are busy, or who've got terribly important jobs and think, what am I going to get from this? You know, we talked a bit about framing. We talked about process of facilitation, and I'm very aware Ruth Benthoven has just arrived, and I'm going to explain. I'm sort of speaking to her processes, so I hope I'm going to do them justice. But we didn't. We touched on quite a bit on making, because all three of us had done imagination practices which involved making together, and why that is so important, and what comes from that process of making together. I mentioned sharing stories, the ability to move around in the space, eating together, you know, the aesthetics of the materials we talked about a bit. We spoke about how you support people to leave their roles at the door and enter. We spoke about different ways in which we've done that, in which we encourage people to just bring themselves. We spoke about framing, different framings, and Kavitha, I don't know if you want to speak about the 3 stages, which I don't have knowledge of, which are ways of kind of opening people from imagination through to action. I don't know if you want to say a little bit about that, because
so it's not it's not mine. It's a Brazilian philosopher, Paulo Freire, and he talks about the consciousness of how you can start from a naive kind of consciousness to kind of magical, and then you hit a critical consciousness where you take on agency. And I just said that we kind of used a simplified version to explain to people how it's possible to look at things in many different ways, and there can be agency in imagining, and it's not just about, you know, just one way of thinking at it. So we just used it as an introduction.
So I think that's broadly what we covered. We didn't spend a lot of time on going from imagination into agency. We didn't spend as much time on that. And I don't know if anyone else wants from the group, others want to add anything. No, Kate. Okay, that's me, I think.
Was there?
I think what.
Sorry, I was going to just ask if there's anything edgy or kind of difficult to articulate.
I mean, for me, okay, this is just purely for me, but the difficulty I'm experiencing is thinking of my local neighbourhood in Tooting and all of the people I'd like to be there, and communicating it to people that I think would be really great to have in the room, but it will feel a very long way from what they might be interested in doing. But I think that they would bring something really great to it, and there's all kinds of people for different reasons, from, you know, all kinds of people will have different resistances to what I think would be brilliant to have them as part of. That feels edgy to me. How do you open this up to people who don't think, oh, that's interesting? Yeah.
And so the language, right? How the language shifted and across that felt the edge point for lots of the different audiences and convenings that we had.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And what I found fascinating in your conversation was this question of how, although you said you didn't focus so much on the move from imagining to action, I think I heard ways in which, as practitioners, you were all constantly prefiguring action. So prefiguring action in the setup of the participation, prefiguring action through engaging in material practice, in materially making through the workshop. So I heard this kind of constant iteration of a move into agency that foreshadowed moves into agency that were to come. Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask the next group that I was part of. Oh, and actually, maybe I should ask the group that Hannah stayed with. Let's go to those folks next.
So that was group 1. Sorry, group 1. Just got landed in it. Jo, were you Were you sort of good at feedback?
I'll give it a go. Okay. I'm just going to kind of read directly and spontaneously pop out of the notes here, but I have agency for imagination, the challenge of a lot of resistance fueled by the pain, struggle, and oppression, grief, and trauma of these groups, which carries doubts about the value of imagination work, while all the rest of the struggles are very real and tangible. And I have validation processes, staying with the questions and inspiring the art of inquiry for these people as a possible access point. Trust being a big issue, building trust within a group specifically, but especially as an outsider looking in, and how we need to help build that sense of trust and a sense to give the group and maybe a member from within that group that sense of agency and leadership to give themselves and each other the space and ability to be imaginative, to give them all permission to play together in these ways, play loosely being used, of course. And the potential of identifying one or more from within a community to lead and facilitate. And I propose, I don't know if this is good or not, but that we even be willing to not engage with the actual workshop as outsiders and just really kind of then follow up and try and receive some of the data and warm data and experiences from an after kind of glow of the experience. And how in the midst of the struggle and challenges might we introduce some of this work, and potentially even doing that through identifying existing rituals and ceremonies that are already a part of their reality, and then seeing if they can, these kinds of practices could potentially just be kind of sneakily almost woven into them. Well, Hannah, you brought in the youth agency aspect of it, which I really dug, of identifying someone from each place's to the youth population to kind of take a leadership role. And that was really intriguing. One of the challenges we also saw is if we even get to this point of really integrating and having that sense of agency brought to these communities and having them explore these imagination practices, how then can we support and propel it forward beyond that moment? And that was a really tricky one. We weren't quite sure identifying local agencies and economic springs from within the community that can possibly be redirected to support and facilitate these. I really love the idea of storytelling and art being the qualitative outcome that could potentially then qualify and strengthen the movement both within these individual groups, communities, areas, but also more importantly, and I think kind of excitingly, if us within a greater collective imagination community can come together in some form of tangible outlet of the work inside of all these communities and our own, that validation could strengthen their and encourage them to practice these processes more, right? To see like a creative outlet, whether it be a communal art project that lives on the land or some other form, but what if that then has a space in the public sphere that can be pointed to, so they have that sense of pride, agency, ability to dream further into these processes together. Yes, there was more, and I'm sure I'm leaving something out, and I welcome Andy or others to bring things in. Very inspiring though. I'm intrigued with what we were exploring together, for sure. It did dance between the agency and the craft, for sure. Yeah, Andy, anything?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just an interesting observation, even at the start when we were deciding who should filter back to the group, that we went with sort of native English speakers, and we kind of didn't even sort of question that was how the process should be. And I would sort of just raise a little bit of attention to that. I think there's something interesting in the notion of allowing that plurality to exist throughout these kind of processes, that not to do too much filtering through. And Joe and I just happen to be, and we have certain demographic qualities to ourselves as well. So I think we just need to be conscious of that as well. So, I mean, the only other thing that came out to me that stood out was around this idea that you still got to do that bridging between two worlds stuff. So even if you're in a community or part of a group who really understands the value of imagination practice, we still have to translate that back into a system that is quantified. It's kind of valuing certain things over others. And that felt like, when you're talking about what are the real barriers and sticking points, that feels like a significant one. We can't stay in, let's just say, I know it's not a bubble, but we can't stay in our own bubble. We have to find translation language to make that land.
Brilliant. So coming back to that question of language and how that invites or doesn't invite people, or creates the space in which people can participate. Ruth, I'm going to let you in again. Here we go. Would anyone from the second group I joined, so either Carmet or Lulu or Mark would like to share reflections from their conversation?
So I volunteered to take the notes because it's very early where Lulu is, and Carmen, she's looking forward to a siesta, and Penny had a terrible sore throat and she had to leave because she had other duties to go to. So then it turned out that my internet connection was really unstable, so it had this really fractured but fantastic experience. So if I don't do justice to the fantastic conversation, it's only because I can only hear.
Reflections filtered through. We'll take the reflections filtered through sleeplessness, faulty internet, and the rest.
So the main things were, we started off with kind of, Lulu was talking about the marginalized ways of imagining, and the fact that, you know, they do the California dreaming kind of stuff over in using that kind of language of dreaming and imagination, and obviously this connects back to a kind of many indigenous ways of being and ways of knowing. You know, imagination was, I think, much more. We got into discussion about how imagination is used by those in power to colonialize essentially the ways of thinking and being. And the imagination is all around us, but it's kind of hidden from us. And perhaps our education systems start to extract the imagination ability of young people, because it's a way of social control. If you're spending your time imagining things being different, then you might not want to sit in your class and just listen. So it's a process which happens and kind of carries on through life. And Karma had, you know, talked especially about kind of, well, how do you facilitate that engagement with imagination and embody it? You know, so again, we talked about play, but we talked about the fact that imagination isn't just in this kind of concept of the kind of cognitive mind or whatever. It's something which is kind of all encompassing, holistic, and how do you, if you've been channeled into one way of imagining, how are you? So we talked about hospicing modernity. So Vanessa Andreotti his work. We talked about David Graeber. Penny gave us a lot of really amazing connections to eminent imagination, I think it was, from David Graeber, and we talked about the creating spaciousness was one of the things that needed, you know, creating these spaces where imagination can happen, and the importance of kind of slowing down. Times are urgent, so we need to slow down, make space for imagination. The way that modernity pushes people towards an imaginary future, which is obviously often a dystopian kind of imagination, the fear, rather than one which is abundant and regenerative. So yeah, so there was lots of really interesting kind of quotes and sources that we could made. So it's also about that kind of, finally, maybe that the way that imagination is a fantastic process for unlocking oppression. And I think that links back to the group Kathina was talking about, Freire and critical consciousness and those kind of things. So there was a bit of that link. Carmit and Lulu, please help me. I'm sure there's lots of really interesting stuff that I missed, but yeah, it was a lovely conversation.
Carmit, Lulu, anything that you would like to add?
I think Mark did a great job.
Amazing, amazing. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Let's hear back from our final group of folks and then move into a bit of a collective conversation about what the implications of the things that we've been discussing are for our practice. Who would like to speak from the final group? Mikal, you've just unmuted, and so has Lizzie. I'm assuming one or both of you, perhaps.
Lizzie.
Should I start? And Jake?
Or Jake, yeah. Lizzie.
And Jake, well, everyone chime in. So I think we started with something that felt like it was core, which was regulated nervous systems for ourselves and collectively. And because those regulated nervous systems represent safety, which allows us to connect with the friction of difference, which might otherwise be felt as a threat. And so this kind of starting point of needing to come back into ourselves and to access connection with ancestors, the earth, our inner knowing. And I think that took us into one of the places that felt more difficult or something to grapple with, which was then the idea of action. And so this, I guess there was conversation which was, do we need to start from that place of coming back into ourselves, or is that not always the case? And I think, Mikal, you said, I think therefore I act, as kind of like the representation of the sort of Western neoliberal acting on the world. And then Jake told a really interesting story, which I've sort of phrased like as the summary of it is kind of, I imagine, through necessitated action. So effectively the action is required because of what's needed in a specific moment, but that actually unlocks imagination and collective imagining, because through that process of making together, that's accessed. So that felt like kind of something that that there were different perspectives, and maybe those things kind of sit together. I think it back into kind of the core things, the word honesty that Devon shared early on felt like a really helpful word, and effectively the being able to express care for all in terms of the kind of practical conditions in which we come into contact with each other and can imagine together, and at the same time recognizing how we share space together and who brings what. And this came to another, I guess, edgy or difficult or place, which was around economic positions and caste or class intersectionality, that how can we be fully together and trust that we really are fully together, and that everyone is showing up as they want to, and whether it is in fact still easier or more difficult to access, even with kind of the perception that everything feels fair and equal. But how do we know that there's kind of honesty? And one of the things that sort of felt maybe difficult to articulate, and for me personally, like I definitely had moments of the languaging and how the communicating the what is felt or known internally in a way that can bridge divides to enable their ideas to be expressed in both a way that has kind of the right intention from the person who is communicating, and knowing that you can never control how something is received by someone else. So I guess those were the things that that from like a really rich conversation, which felt like it was only 10 minutes and we could have gone on for hours and I would have loved to. But Joe, from your notes, is there more? I mean, Jake, sorry.
I thought that was a brilliant summary, Lizzie. Thanks so much. I guess only to expand on a point that you already covered about it felt like that the phrase, I think it was Michal, you used the friction of difference and the kind of creating spaces where safely we're bridging experiences and different positions, and the friction of difference that allows us to see as a fish that sees the water that it swims in. When you see something different, and that opens up much larger horizons of possibility. That felt like a very, I mean, I'm paraphrasing you, Michal, but that felt really like the sort of the point where lots of these themes came together, because it's also about how do you help people to feel safe and equal and so on in those sorts of spaces.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much. And I think one thing that's coming through is like, none of this work is easy. And in some ways, neither should it be, because it is about coming into relationship with others in a way that enables us to really see one another so that we can imagine together. But I'm going to hand back to Hannah for a last few minutes of collective discussion.
So really, it's just an invitation now, for having heard from each other, to reflect on, I suppose, what feels really important, but also what, particularly in terms of a community of practitioners, you know, does this conversation reveal any particular kind of needs or learning edges we have? Yeah, Michal.
Yeah, just to, I thought a common thread or theme I heard was the languaging. And I think that there's this tension between what I think I got to at the end of our conversation, which agreed with Lizzie, like we really wanted longer, was that languaging is both a tension, right? If we think about it as the fact that we don't have the language, that sort of creates the possibility of creating new language and imagining new things, and also just teasing out and putting into language the imaginative practices and capacities, and also like ways of being that don't fit the status quo of like the privileged white modern Western, right? Like imaginary, right? So that in the absence of languaging, and how that sometimes can be a space where people feel less than, can also be flipped and made like, okay, we don't act like the privileged language that academics tend to use and professionals and experts tend to use. That's not what we want right now. We want to actually find language that gives us the capacity to speak about these other worlds, right? Because that's what imagining requires. And so that we can see that as both a tension, but also like a really right spot of like the work of languaging and teasing out and helping these friction points of difference can allow like, oh, when you were just saying that thing, like that is something I want to be able to language, right? Like I want to, and that can happen from, that can equalize things, or not equalize, right? But like shift and destabilize traditional forms of hierarchy and allow, yeah, that's just something I wanted to say, because a lot of us talked about languaging and this tension that we have when we're trying to work in community. And if we use that rather than as an obstacle, as like an actually intentional friction generative thing, that could be neat.
Hearing that, I got really, sorry, Mark, can I have 2 seconds? I got very excited about like the possibility of being in a group with people and then being like, I don't know what I don't have a word for this. It's like, okay, cool, make one up. Like we made language, we get to decide, and just like letting the communities that we're working with be the people that language this complete shift that we're stepping to. And that's such a, thank you for naming it. I'm like very excited to play with that.
I was just going to step in quickly because I need to go and take my cat to the vet with this, you know, the practicalities of life. And it's interesting, we've had this big conversation about imagination. And when I when I'm trying to write about imagination, I keep bumping up against reality and what is, you know, how do we understand what reality is? And often when I'm in the communities that I'm working in, people talk about being more worried about the end of the week than the end of the world. So when you talk, it feels to me like I'm even in a privileged position just to try and engage somebody in a conversation about imagination, because they're saying, look, do you know what I mean? I literally don't have the space for this because my electricity bill's through the roof. My daughter's suicidal. So it's kind of like trauma informed imaginative practice. It is being really sensitive to the fact that there's something about us. Many of us will been through trauma and things like that, but we've got to a space wherein we can have those conversations about imagination. And it's like, but it's the sensitivity to go in, to invite people into those spaces, and not be the kind of authoritarian figure saying, well, you really need to think about imagination because it's like great stuff and it can really, and it's like, how do you do that with authenticity? How do you do it with sensitivity, relationality? So that is one of the things that keeps coming back to me, is to not feel like some kind of authority figure, that's saying, you really need to look at your life in a different way. And it's, I can't do that, and I wouldn't do it. And I'm sure that none of you folks do that, but it's just something that's very real to me, and I would like to have be able to talk about it more with yourselves. And I wish I didn't have to take my cat to the vet, but she's got 4 years, so I need to go. Maybe another time.
Yeah, just a quick jump on that to say, how do we speak about imagination not as a privilege or something that we can do because it's interesting and fun and whatever, but it's actually a human need. It's a basic need. How do we change that? Someone said earlier, like validation of the value, because there's so much doubt in our society about the value of imagination is seen as something frivolous, something that from the fantastic to the we could do. It's a so how do we, this would be an interesting thing for me to consider together, so how do we validate it and how do we help us to see that, well, everybody to feel, not to think about it, but to feel that it's a basic need that we need to tend to, or we'll dry up.
Thank you, Colin. Hilary.
Yeah, I work a lot in museums. I was thinking I was coming back to museum, and I was thinking about the materiality thing that we were talking about earlier, and thinking, in the end, everything that we've created, we've imagined first. And if we could find a way to express that, because that's very grounding. If you think about the chair you sit on and the pen you write with and the everything somebody imagined that they could create something that could make marks, and so everything that is around us was imagined by somebody before it was made. I don't know whether there's a way to kind of use that sense to really ground it in this is something that is just every day. Everything that we make comes at some point from our imagination. I'm playing in my head with that.
I think we've got Gracie and then Ruth.
Yeah, thank you. I have this conversation about imagination being a right or a need. I mean, someone who started working with the internet when it was created in Brazil. I had to talk about the internet as a right in the 90s, and it was really hard to convince social movements that the internet was a right. So I really don't use that framework anymore. What I like to offer in the conversations that I have is that imagination is a field of dispute. It's not that it's not out there. It is, but it's been used by powerful forces to lead us into imagining towards about some possibilities, which are not the only ones. So I think that this is a deeply political conversation. What we are allowed to imagine, what we are induced to imagine, also through the mainstream industry, to the cinema, to the social media. This is not by chance that we are being led to imagine about the world in a particular way. How can we, make another, how to open other doors of possibilities about that, and also making it very visible how much our imagination is already being appropriated somehow or instigated into directions that not always are for our best interest. So I really love that conversation as part of the political conversations that I need to have with the communities and social justice movements that I work with. So this is my offer.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you. I'm just popping in here. I hope that's okay. Really rich to hear everybody speak. And what I was then is that imagination is often taught as an individual practice. It's like what the last speaker said in terms of that actually where our training is to imagine the sort of life that you would have in a neoliberal kind of modernity focus. And actually what's less practiced and which is more dangerous and political, I really agree, is this sense of the collective imagination. And also really thinking about what Ruth, you framed earlier about this prefiguring. Like I'm really, as a practitioner, I think that's such a rich space, and this sense of how do we, and it's like it's a safer space where we can practice and rehearse what it is to imagine together. And sometimes outside of the pressure of that imagination practice or process, having to lead directly to a specific action. And I suppose I'm really interested in when we create these spaces where we're prefiguring or rehearsing, for me, often in that time travel way, the future, actually, how can we be really focusing on the kind of competencies that are being developed as action, so that the ability to collaborate, the ability to feel more on a level playing field, the ability to use our hands, the ability to take on a role, the ability to realize things are fluid, are all capacities that we need to build in order to be able to then take action together rather than necessarily. So I'm interested in how we define the action that comes out of imagination practice as well, and for us to look at that broadly as well. Anyway, I could say more, but
so
Ruth, you're breaking up. But that was such a wonderful point. We heard it all beautifully before we lost you. Lulu, can I ask you to speak really quickly, and then we are going to have to call it a day because we are 1 minute over. So I'm really sorry about the person I can't hear from. But Lulu, let's hear from you.
I was just excited about also the capacity, building on what Ruth and Gracie said, to what does it mean to create that spaciousness, like the infrastructure to create the spaciousness to move from someone else's imagination, which is where we're living right now, to our collective imagination, and really thinking about the tools, the capacities, the infrastructure to create that space. That's something I think is really interesting, to like create the rupture and the opening from shifting from one imagination to another. And I think often we think about just imagining as like the first step, but it's actually shifting away from one into another, and that process is really interesting to me. So I just wanted to offer that, and also just express gratitude. It's been a really session.
Yes, I would also like to express gratitude. I just feel like I'd like to spend a whole week with you all, at least. And actually doing this in a room with your glorious bodies, which are so much a part of how we communicate with one another and imagine together. And I'm missing all your bodies right now. I understand you all have legs, and I think they're great. So thank you, everyone. Really curious about if there are particular threads you'd like to pick up, send me an email. Because it's up to us to make the space, isn't it? If we want to take these forward and we want those spacious places to talk, it's up to us to see if we can do that. So I'm happy to be the convener of any ideas that you might want to take forward. This video will be shared with the Collective Imagination Practice community. Obviously, the breakout rooms were not recorded, and I'll write something up and bung it on our Medium publication. But thank you so much for your deep expertise and care and humility in joining these very emergent questions and spaces. Thank you. Anything you'd like to add, Ruth?
Yeah, just a heartfelt thank you again, and what a great pleasure it has been to be with all of you this afternoon, and also to say that we will be, we've got a little time left to go with the research, but we will be sharing it with the community, and we're hoping to do so in a variety of formats, hopefully in a way that you can take up and use, that's practical, and not only take up and use, but take up and write on and change and evolve over time. So yeah, very grateful to all of your time.
Bye for now.